Welcome back, guys, to Mr. Cursed. I've got 8 real November hiking stories that'll make your skin crawl. These aren't just scary tales. Real people went into the deep Appalachian woods and barely made it out alive. After you hear what happened to them, you'll think twice before hiking alone. Smash that subscribe button and hit like. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's dive into these terrifying true stories from America's most haunted mountains. I'm 42 years old, and back then I was managing a grocery store in a little Virginia town that barely shows up on maps. Had been for about 8 years, working my way up from cashier while my marriage fell apart piece by piece. My husband Danny had this way of making me feel small, you know? Started with words, then escalated to shoves, then worse. By November of 2019, I was hiding bruises under long sleeves and telling people I'd walked into doors so many times I think they stopped believing me. The night he grabbed a kitchen knife and told me he'd kill me if I ever tried to leave, I knew I had to get out. Filed for divorce the next morning, but Danny had friends everywhere in town. Guys who'd tell him where I went, what I was doing. I needed somewhere to disappear for a while. Somewhere to think and plan without looking over my shoulder every 5 minutes. That's how I ended up heading to Moonshine Hollow in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Found it on a hiking forum, remote, barely marked trails, perfect for someone who needed to vanish for a few days. November meant the tourist season was over, so I'd have the whole place to myself. Packed my tent, enough food for 4 days, and drove up there on a Monday morning while Danny was at work. The trailhead was just a wooden post with faded paint, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. No other cars in the gravel pullout, which was exactly what I wanted. The path wound through thick hardwood forest, past old stone foundations and rusted metal equipment scattered between the trees. You could tell families had lived back here once, probably during Prohibition, making moonshine in these hidden hollows where the law couldn't find them. I felt safer walking among those ruins than I had in my own house for months. These were people who'd lived on their own terms, away from anyone who might hurt them. For the first time in years, I could breathe without checking behind me every few steps. Found a good spot to camp near what looked like an old still operation. Stone foundation about 6 feet square, with pieces of copper tubing and glass jars scattered around it. The setup felt protected somehow, like the mountain people who'd worked here were still watching over the place. I pitched my tent on level ground about 20 yards away and spent the afternoon exploring. That first night was the most peaceful sleep I'd had in months. No footsteps in the hallway, no doors slamming, no waiting for Danny to come home drunk and angry. Just wind in the trees and the distant sound of water running somewhere down the mountain. But Tuesday morning, something felt different. I was making coffee on my camp stove when I noticed handprints on the old cabin foundation. Fresh prints, pressed into the weathered wood like someone had grabbed the beam for support. Except these prints only had 4 fingers. And they were too long, with joints in places that didn't make sense. I told myself it was probably just shadows playing tricks, or maybe an animal had brushed against the wood. But when I looked closer, the prints were definitely palm-shaped. Just wrong somehow. That afternoon, I hiked deeper into the hollow and found more still sites. The smell hit me first, sharp and chemical, like battery acid mixed with rotting meat. It was coming from the largest operation, where someone had carved fresh symbols into the bark of surrounding trees. Triangles inside triangles, spirals that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The carvings were too precise, too geometric to be human work. I should have left then. Looking back now, every instinct I had was screaming at me to pack up and get out. But I'd spent so many years ignoring my instincts, letting Danny convince me I was paranoid or overreacting. I figured I was just jumpy from everything that had happened at home. Tuesday night, I learned I should have listened to myself. Around midnight, I heard breathing outside my tent. Slow, wet sounds coming from multiple directions. Not the quick panting of an animal, but deliberate, measured breaths like something was trying to stay quiet. The sounds synchronized after a few minutes, like several creatures were coordinating their movements. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't turn it on. Through the thin tent wall, I could see pale shapes moving between the trees. Tall figures, too thin to be human, with skin that looked wet in the moonlight. They moved without making any noise on the forest floor, gliding between the trees like they weighed nothing. I held my breath and stayed perfectly still until the shapes disappeared. Didn't sleep the rest of the night. Wednesday morning revealed something that made my blood go cold. My belongings had been moved. Backpack, water bottles, food containers, everything arranged in perfect circles around my campsite. Someone or something had been studying my supplies while I slept, examining each item, learning about human needs. The worst part was how methodical it all looked, like a scientist cataloging specimens. I started packing immediately, but it was too late. They were already watching. I could feel eyes on me as I stuffed my sleeping bag into its sack. Caught glimpses of pale skin behind tree trunks, movement in my peripheral vision that stopped whenever I turned to look directly. The creatures had been human once. I could see traces of old tattoos on their skin, remnants of clothing hanging from their emaciated frames. But whatever had happened to them in this hollow had changed them into something else, something that hunted. They began testing me, seeing how I'd react. One would approach from the front, while others flanked from different angles. They communicated through clicking sounds, planning their movements like a pack of wolves. I realized they were learning my behavior patterns, figuring out exactly how to capture me. The final hunt started Wednesday evening. They surrounded my camp in perfect formation, cutting off every escape route I could think of. Their pale faces showed no emotion, just calculating intelligence. I understood then that I wasn't dealing with mindless monsters. These things had studied me for 2 days and knew exactly how I'd try to run. In desperation, I grabbed my camp stove fuel and poured it over the old moonshine equipment. The flames spread fast, lighting up the whole hollow like daylight. That's when I saw how many of them there really were. Dozens of pale figures hiding in the forest, all watching me with those empty, intelligent eyes. But the fire confused them somehow. Their coordination broke down, and they scattered away from the burning still sites like the flames caused them physical pain. I ran while they were retreating, crashing through the underbrush toward where I'd left my car, made it out of there with nothing but the clothes on my back and my keys. Didn't stop, driving until I hit the interstate, and didn't stop shaking until I was back in town. Found out later that families had been disappearing in Moonshine Hollow for generations. Local people knew to stay away, but they didn't put up signs or warnings because they figured the mountain would keep its own secrets. I never went back for my camping gear. Never went hiking alone again either. And when other women tell me they're thinking about disappearing into the mountains to escape bad situations, I always warn them. Some places in Appalachia change people into things that hunt. The mountains remember everything, even things that used to be human. To this day, I still check my car mirrors more than I probably should. Not looking for Danny anymore. I got that restraining order, and he left me alone after the divorce went through. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself wondering if those things in the hollow are still learning, still practicing, still waiting for the next, a person who needs to disappear. I'm 34 years old, and I work construction. Or at least I did until about 8 months ago when I got hurt on the job. My name's Tommy Rodriguez, and I've been an electrician for the better part of a decade. Union guy, good benefits, steady work. That all changed last March when I was working on a commercial job downtown and took a bad fall off a ladder. Messed up my back pretty good, herniated disc, pinched nerves, the whole 9 yards. Workers' comp covered the medical bills, but being laid up for months while doing physical therapy and waiting for my back to heal, that was a different kind of hell altogether. By October, I was going stir crazy. The doctor said I was cleared for light duty, but my confidence was shot. I'd lie awake at night wondering if I'd ever be able to do the work I loved again, if I'd ever feel like myself. My brother Carlos suggested I try hiking to build my strength back up and clear my head. Start small, he said. Just get back out there. The new River Gorge in West Virginia seemed perfect, challenging enough to test myself, but with well-marked trails I couldn't get lost on. I needed to prove to myself that my body could still handle something physical, that I wasn't just going to be sitting around feeling sorry for myself for the rest of my life. I drove down on a Friday afternoon in early November. The fall colors were incredible that year. Reds and golds stretched out as far as you could see. I found a campsite near the endless wall trail. Nothing fancy, just a fire ring and a picnic table. The plan was simple. Spend Saturday hiking, test out my back, and if everything went well, maybe I'd have the confidence to tell my foreman I was ready to come back to work. Saturday morning felt like therapy. The air was crisp, probably around 40 degrees, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. I took my time on the trail, stopping whenever my back started to ache, but honestly, I felt better than I had in months. The endless wall trail isn't too steep, mostly just follows the rim of the gorge, but it's long enough to give you a real workout. For the first time since the accident, I felt like my old self again. My back held up better than I expected, and I even managed to scramble down to a few overlooks to take pictures. I set up camp that evening, feeling more optimistic than I had in a long time. Made myself some dinner on my camp stove, built a small fire, and just sat there watching the stars come out. I was actually looking forward to going back to work, to getting my life back on track. I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. Around 9 o'clock, I started hearing sounds echoing up from the valley below. At first, I thought maybe there was another campsite down there, but the sounds were weird. Power tools running, diesel engines, men shouting what sounded like work commands. The thing is, I know construction sounds. I've been around them my whole adult life, and these were definitely construction sounds. Nail guns, circular saws, someone operating a lift. But when I looked down into the valley with my flashlight, I couldn't see any lights. No work site, no crew, nothing. I figured maybe the sound was carrying from somewhere else, bouncing off the rock walls in strange ways. Sound does funny things in the mountains. But as I listened more carefully, I started recognizing specific things. The particular whine of a wire stripping tool. The rhythmic hammering of someone installing conduit. Someone was definitely doing electrical work down there, and they were doing it in the dark, which made no sense at all. Then I heard someone calling my name through what sounded like a bullhorn. "Rodriguez, get back to work." Just like a foreman would yell across a job site. My blood went cold. There was no way anyone down there could know my name, and there was definitely no construction crew working at 9 o'clock at night in the middle of nowhere. The sounds kept getting louder and more detailed as the night went on. I heard my own voice arguing with supervisors about safety violations, the same arguments I'd had 100 times over the years. I heard the specific sound of the electrical panel I'd been working on the day I fell, that metallic clang it made when you opened it. Then I heard something that made my stomach drop, the sharp crack of electricity arcing, followed by a scream that sounded exactly like my own voice. The valley was replaying my accident. Not just similar sounds, but the exact sequence of events from that day. The snap of the wire, the sparks, my fall, even the sound of my body hitting the concrete. Over and over again, like someone had recorded it and was playing it back through massive speakers hidden in the trees. But it got worse. I started hearing voices I recognized. My coworkers talking about how I should have been more careful, how I'd always been sloppy with safety protocols. Things that weren't true, but things I'd worried about in my darkest moments during recovery. "Rodriguez always cut corners," one voice said. "Bound to happen eventually," said another. These were conversations that had never actually happened, but hearing them felt like having my worst fears confirmed. My brother's voice echoed through the trees. "Face it, Tommy, you're never going to work construction again. You're done." Then my ex-wife's voice, clear as day. "I can't support a man who can't support himself. What good are you now?" Every cruel thought I'd had about myself, every fear about my future, was being broadcast back at me from invisible speakers scattered throughout the forest. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, stress-induced hallucinations or something. But the sounds were too clear, too specific. I could hear the exact model of lift we'd been using that day, the particular squeak its hydraulics made. I could hear my supervisor's radio crackling with the same static it always had. These weren't random construction sounds. They were perfectly recreated memories of every traumatic moment from my job. Sunday morning brought no relief. If anything, the phantom construction sounds were getting closer, more personal. I could hear my own voice calling from different directions around my campsite. "I'm weak," my voice said from the trees to my left. "I'm useless." It continued from somewhere behind me. "I'll never be the same," it whispered from the valley below. The mountain was using my own self-doubt against me, reflecting back every negative thought I'd had during my recovery. I realized the sounds were getting physically closer too. What had started as distant echoes from the valley were now coming from just outside my tent. I could hear footsteps circling my campsite, but when I looked out, there was nothing there. Just the sound of work boots on gravel, the same boots I wore every day on the job. In desperation, I started shouting back. If this place was going to echo my worst thoughts, maybe I could give it something else to work with. "I'm strong," I yelled toward the valley. "I survived." I screamed at the trees. "I'm going back to work." The words felt stupid coming out of my mouth, like some kind of self-help nonsense, but something strange happened. My confident words started echoing back, drowning out the negative voices. The more I shouted positive things about myself, the quieter the phantom construction sounds became. It was like the forest could only amplify what I was willing to give it, and I was finally giving it something different to work with. I broke camp as fast as I could, shouting encouragement to myself the whole time. "I'm a good electrician," I called out as I packed my tent. "I know what I'm doing," I yelled as I loaded my truck. The negative echoes faded with each positive word I spoke, and by the time I was driving out of the campsite, the only sounds were my own voice, and the normal forest noises I'd expected to hear all along. Looking back now, I think that mountain tested more than just my physical strength. It forced me to confront every doubt I had about myself, every fear about my future. The weird thing is, my back pain actually got better as I drove home. Not completely. I still have bad days, but the constant ache that had been with me for months started to fade. I went back to work the following week. Light duty at first, but within a month I was back to full electrical work. I still don't know what happened in that valley, and honestly, I don't talk about it much. But I learned something important that weekend. Sometimes the biggest obstacles we face aren't physical at all. Sometimes we just need to stop letting our worst fears do all the talking. I still hike, but I stay away from the New River Gorge. Some places test you once, and that's enough. I was 67 when my husband Frank passed away after 45 years of marriage. He'd been talking about hiking the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky for as long as I could remember, always saying we'd do it someday when we retire. Well, someday never came for him. 3 months after the funeral, I decided I was going to complete that hike myself. Call it closure, call it crazy, but I needed to do something that felt like honoring his memory. My grown kids thought I'd lost my mind. A 6-7-year-old retired elementary teacher heading into the mountains alone in November. But honestly, after teaching 3rd grade for 40 years, I figured I could handle whatever the wilderness threw at me. The place Frank had always talked about was called Blackberry Hollow, tucked away in the Daniel Boone National Forest. It wasn't on any tourist maps, just a place he'd heard about from some old-timers at the hardware store. They called it quiet country, no cell service, hardly any visitors, just miles of untouched forest and creek beds. Perfect for someone who wanted to be alone with their thoughts. I packed light, just a small tent, sleeping bag, and enough food for 2 days. The trail into Blackberry Hollow started off a gravel road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. My little Honda Civic bounced over potholes and around fallen branches until I reached what looked like it might have been a parking area once upon a time. There was an old wooden sign, so weathered I could barely make out Blackberry carved into it. The trail itself was beautiful in that stark November way. The trees were mostly bare, creating this cathedral of gray branches overhead. What struck me right away was how quiet it was. I mean, really quiet. No birds singing, no insects buzzing. Even the wind seemed muted. After 40 years of listening to children chatter all day, you'd think I'd appreciate the silence, but this felt different. Wrong somehow. About a mile in, I started noticing these stone cairns placed along the trail. You know, those little stacks of rocks that hikers sometimes build as markers. These were perfectly balanced, each one about 3 feet high, and they had something peculiar about them. On top of each cairn was a small personal item, reading glasses on one, a wedding ring on another, car keys, a wristwatch. I figured maybe it was some kind of memorial thing, people leaving tokens for loved ones who'd passed. It actually made me feel better about being there for Frank. But as I kept walking, the air started feeling thick and hard to breathe. My ears kept popping like I was changing elevation rapidly, even though the trail was fairly level. I'm no stranger to mountain hiking. Frank and I used to do day hikes all the time, but this was different. It felt like the atmosphere itself was pressing down on me. That's when I found the footprints in a muddy section near a creek crossing. Fresh prints, maybe a few hours old at most. They were human-sized, but wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. Only 4 toes, and instead of heel strikes, there were claw marks in the mud. Whatever made them had been walking upright on feet that weren't quite human. I stood there, staring at those prints for a long time, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was someone with a foot deformity, or unusual boots, or I was misinterpreting what I was looking at. But deep down, something told me to turn around and go back to my car. I should have listened to that feeling. Instead, I kept going. The trail wound deeper into the hollow, following the creek bed. The stone cairns appeared more frequently now, and I started really looking at the items on top of them. These weren't just random objects, they were personal things, intimate things. A child's hair clip, prescription glasses, a man's wedding band that looked just like the one Frank used to wear. By evening, I'd set up my tent in a small clearing about 3 miles from the trailhead. I'd camped alone plenty of times, but as darkness fell, that oppressive silence became something else entirely. That's when I first heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps circling my campsite. Too measured for any animal, too heavy for a normal person. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to whatever it was walking around and around my tent. The steps had this strange rhythm, in not quite human, but trying to be. Through the thin fabric of my tent wall, I could see a shadow moving between the trees. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with arms that seemed to hang past its knees. When it stopped moving, I could hear it breathing, this slow, rattling, wet sound that made my blood run cold. That's when things got really strange. The creature, and I knew by then it wasn't human, started moving items around my campsite. I could hear it picking up my hiking poles, my water bottle, even my boots that I'd left outside the tent. But it wasn't just moving them randomly. Through the mesh window, I could see it arranging everything in perfect geometric patterns around my tent. It was studying my belongings, learning about them. And me. I realized then what those cairns really were. They weren't memorial markers, they were trophies. Evidence of previous hikers who'd come through Blackberry Hollow and never made it back out. The worst part came around midnight when I got a glimpse of its face through a gap in my tent. The moonlight hit it just right, and I saw pale gray skin stretched too tight over angular bones. Its eyes reflected the light like an animal's, but there was an intelligence there that was ancient and alien. When it noticed me watching, it tilted its head, mimicking my exact movement with scientific precision. It was learning from me. I don't remember making the decision to run. One moment I was frozen with terror. The next I was scrambling out of my sleeping bag, grabbing my car keys, and bolting from the tent. I ran through the darkness, stumbling over roots and rocks, guided only by my small flashlight and pure panic. Behind me, I could hear it following, not running, just walking with those same measured steps. Like it knew I couldn't escape anyway. Somehow, I made it back to my car. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. As I drove away, I could see it in my rearview mirror, standing in the road, watching me leave with those horrible reflective eyes. I never went back for my camping gear. Never reported what I saw to the authorities. Who would believe me anyway? But I still think about those cairns, about all those personal items left behind by people who thought they were just going for a hike in the mountains. To this day, I can't stand perfect silence. I keep the TV on even when I'm sleeping, and I never go hiking alone anymore. Hell, I barely go hiking at all. Some experiences change you permanently, and that night in Blackberry Hollow was one of them. Frank never did get his mountain adventure. Looking back now, I think maybe that was for the best. I was 67 when Frank died, and honestly, I thought that was it for me too. We'd been married 45 years, and I couldn't imagine doing anything without him. Frank had always talked about hiking up to Pilot Rock in the Daniel Boone National Forest down in Kentucky, ETM. kept showing me pictures in those outdoor magazines, pointing at this overlook and saying we'd go when he retired. Well, retirement came and went, and then the cancer took him that October. After the funeral, I found myself holding that little wooden box he'd made in his workshop, the one with his ashes, and something told me I needed to take him to that overlook. My kids thought I'd lost my mind completely, a 6-7-year-old woman hiking alone in November. But they didn't understand. I needed closure, and Frank would have wanted to see those mountains. The Red River Gorge was everything Frank said it would be. Golden maples everywhere, crisp mountain air, trails that weren't too crowded once November hit. I'd been hiking most of my life, so the physical part didn't worry me. What surprised me was how peaceful I felt carrying Frank's ashes in my pack. For the first time since he passed, the grief wasn't crushing my chest. Other hikers I met were respectful when I told them what I was doing. This young couple even offered to help carry my gear. I made camp near Pilot Rock that first evening, planning to scatter Frank's ashes at sunrise. The campsite felt perfect. Private, but close enough to the overlook. I set up my tent, made coffee on my camp stove, and watched the sun disappear through those ancient trees. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. That's when I heard Frank calling my name. Now, I know grief does things to your mind, but this was Frank's voice, clear as day, coming from deeper in the forest. Not scary, just gentle. The way he used to call me in from the garden. "Maggie," he said, and something in my chest knew I needed to follow. I grabbed my flashlight and left the marked trail behind. The woods felt different here, older, with massive trees that must have been growing since before anyone settled these mountains. Every few yards, I saw these stone cairns, just rocks stacked up like trail markers. Frank's voice kept calling, always just ahead, leading me deeper into woods that felt untouched by chainsaws or road crews. Then I saw the others. 5 or 6 elderly folks emerged from behind the trees, all carrying urns like mine. They nodded like they'd been expecting me. A silver-haired woman smiled and said, "Welcome to the crossing place." That's when I noticed her in the center, an elderly Cherokee woman standing in a perfect circle of old-growth trees. Her skin seemed to catch moonlight strangely, and her eyes looked older than the mountains themselves. "Your husband waits in the mountain's heart," she whispered. "But first, you must prove your love is true." I should have been scared, but holding Frank's ashes, I felt only peace. The Cherokee woman began singing in a language I didn't understand, and the other mourners joined in. Their voices blended with wind through those massive trees. That's when I saw Frank. He stood just outside the circle, smiling that crooked smile I'd loved for 46 years. He looked solid, real. The other departed spouses were there too, standing behind their living partners, all looking peaceful. "Come closer, Maggie," Frank said, his voice warm as summer honey. "Come into the circle." The Cherokee woman gestured for me to step forward. "To join them forever, you must release more than ashes. You must release your earthly ties." I stepped into the circle, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees. My breath came out in white puffs, but I was focused on Frank. He was so close now, reaching for my hand. "Just stay here with us," Frank whispered. "Forever." That's when I noticed something wrong. The other mourners hadn't moved, at all. They stood frozen, like statues, their eyes glassy and distant, and behind each departed spouse, I saw what looked like shadows with too many angles, shapes that hurt to look at directly. "Frank?" I whispered. He tilted his head, and his smile stretched too wide. "Yes, Maggie, stay, be at peace, forever." The Cherokee woman's face began to change, her features shifting like smoke. "Join the crossing, feed the mountain's hunger." I looked around the circle again. The other mourners weren't blinking. Their skin had a waxy gray pallor, and I realized with growing horror that some of them looked decades old, clothes from the 70s, the 80s. How long had they been standing here? Frank reached for me again, but his fingers were too long now, joints bending in ways that made my stomach lurch. Behind him, that shadow thing writhed with tentacles or branches or something worse. The Cherokee woman's voice dropped to a growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. "You cannot leave the crossing place. The mountain is hungry, and you have brought it fresh grief to feed upon." That's when my survival instincts kicked in. I clutched Frank's ashes to my chest and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my face and clothes. Behind me, I heard that thing that wasn't Frank calling my name, but the voice was wrong now, too deep, echoing from multiple directions. The Cherokee woman's laughter followed me, a sound like wind through dead leaves. My flashlight beam danced wildly as I stumbled over roots and rocks. Every tree looked the same in the darkness. I was lost, completely turned around, and those voices were getting closer. Then I saw my tent's reflective guy lines catching my light. I'd somehow circled back to my campsite. I threw everything into my pack, not caring about organization, just needing to get out of these woods. The thing calling itself Frank appeared at the edge of my campsite just as I finished packing. "Maggie, you're making a mistake," it said. But Frank's face was melting now, revealing something underneath that I don't want to remember. The crossing place is peaceful. No more grief, no more pain. I backed toward the trail, not taking my eyes off it. "You're not Frank." It smiled with too many teeth. "I'm what Frank became, what you'll become. The mountain takes care of its own." I ran down that trail faster than I'd moved in 20 years. Behind me, the forest erupted with sounds, howling, crashing, and worst of all, the voices of all those mourners calling for me to come back, to complete the crossing. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw lights moving through the trees, dozens of them, like a search party, looking for something they'd lost. That was 15 years ago. I still have Frank's ashes. I tried to scatter them at other places, our backyard, the park where we met, even the funeral home, but they won't pour out of that wooden box. It's like something's keeping them inside, keeping Frank trapped. Sometimes, late at night, I hear his voice calling from the kitchen or the hallway, not the thing that wore his face in those woods. This sounds like the real Frank, desperate and afraid. He's trying to warn me about something, but I can never quite make out the words. I researched that area obsessively, found newspaper articles going back decades about missing hikers, always in November, always elderly folks who'd lost spouses. The authorities blame exposure, getting lost in the woods. But I know better. That Cherokee woman wasn't a spirit guide. She was something old and hungry that had learned to wear human faces, to speak human words. The crossing place isn't about peace. It's about feeding something that lives in the mountain's heart, something that devours grief and love and leaves behind empty shells. I never went back to those woods. But every November, when the nights get long and the air turns cold, I check my doors twice and keep all the lights on. Because sometimes I still hear that thing calling my name in Frank's voice, patient as stone, waiting for me to come back and complete the crossing. And the worst part? Some nights, when the grief gets too heavy and the loneliness too sharp, part of me wants to go. I'm 26 years old, and I've been climbing cell towers for the past 4 years. It's honest work, pays decent, and most people think I'm crazy for doing it. Spending your days 200 feet up in the air, checking equipment and running diagnostics on radio transmitters, you get used to being around electromagnetic fields all the time. Your phone buzzes weird, your watch might skip a few seconds, and you can actually feel the energy humming through the metal when you're working on the bigger towers. That's just part of the job. Back in October, I decided I needed to get away from all that for a weekend. Sounds strange, I know. A guy who works with radio signals wanting to escape them. But when you're surrounded by that electromagnetic noise 40 hours a week, true silence starts to sound pretty appealing. My buddy Jake had told me about this hiking trail up on Devil's Backbone Ridge in Tennessee, said it was perfect for getting completely disconnected. No cell service, no radio stations, nothing but trees and rocks for miles. I figured a solo trip would do me good. Pack light, hike in Saturday morning, camp overnight, hike out Sunday. Simple digital detox. I'd done plenty of solo camping before, and honestly, after spending all week listening to radio chatter and dealing with signal interference, the idea of 2 days with absolutely no electromagnetic activity sounded like paradise. The weather forecast looked perfect. Clear skies, temps in the 60s, no rain expected. I loaded my truck Friday night with basic gear. Tent, sleeping bag, some canned food, water bottles, and my usual electronics, just in case. Phone, GPS unit, portable radio, flashlight. I wasn't planning to use any of it, but old habits die hard when you work in tech. Saturday morning, I drove up to the trailhead around 7 a.m. The parking area was just a gravel pullout next to an old Forest Service sign that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. Devils. Backbone Ridge Trail, 8.2 miles to summit, moderate difficulty. Perfect. I shouldered my pack and started walking, feeling pretty good about leaving civilization behind for a couple days. That feeling lasted about 20 minutes. First thing I noticed was my phone. The battery indicator was jumping around, full charge, then half, then completely dead, then back to full again. I'd charged it overnight, so that shouldn't have been happening. Then my GPS started acting up, showing my location bouncing all over the map like I was teleporting. The screen would flicker between coordinates that put me in 3 different states. I stopped and pulled out my backup electronics. Portable radio was just static on every frequency, which was weird because I should have been able to pick up at least a few AM stations from Knoxville. Even my analog watch, a simple mechanical thing my dad gave me, had stopped working. The second hand was just sitting there, not moving. Now, I deal with electromagnetic interference professionally, so I know what it looks like. Usually it's localized around specific equipment, and it has patterns you can identify. This was different. This felt like I'd walked into some kind of massive EM field that was scrambling everything electronic within range. The interference was stronger than anything I'd ever encountered on any tower, and it seemed to be getting worse the deeper I hiked into the woods. But here's the thing that really got me. I actually felt relieved. All that electronic noise I live with every day was just gone. No cell phone buzzing, no radio chatter bleeding through, no constant low-level hum of electromagnetic activity. For the first time in years, it was actually quiet inside my head. I kept hiking, figuring I'd worry about the electronics later. The trail was well marked, and I had a paper map as backup. The morning was beautiful. Thick hardwood forest, nice steady incline, perfect temperature. I should have been enjoying myself. Instead, I started noticing things that felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. I mean, completely silent. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, no squirrels rustling through the leaves. Even the wind seemed muted, like the air itself was absorbing sound. When I stopped walking, the only thing I could hear was my own breathing and heartbeat. Around noon, I started seeing the metal. At first, I thought it was just trash, a car bumper wedged between 2 trees, some old fence posts scattered around. But as I kept walking, I realized the metal objects were positioned too deliberately to be random. A truck tailgate was standing upright against a boulder, perfectly vertical. 3 old car doors were leaning against tree trunks in a perfect triangle formation. Pieces of chain-link fencing were stretched between trees at precise angles. I stopped at one of the arrangements and looked closer. The metal was old but not rusted. Cleaned, somehow almost polished. And when I got within a few feet of it, my skin started tingling. The same feeling you get when you walk under high-voltage power lines. That subtle electric sensation that makes the hair on your arms stand up. That's when I understood what I was looking at. Someone, or something, had been collecting metal objects and arranging them in specific geometric patterns throughout the forest. The patterns were creating electromagnetic fields, turning the entire area into one massive signal collection network. I touched the truck tailgate, and the metal was warm. Not sun warm, but electrically warm, the way radio equipment gets when it's been running for hours. I could actually hear it humming, a low-frequency vibration that I felt more than heard. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, my electromagnetic field detector, a little device I carry for work, started going crazy. The needle was pinned all the way to the right, indicating EM, the activity off the charts. But the readings were fluctuating in patterns, rhythmic pulses that almost looked like data transmission. By late afternoon, I'd counted at least 30 of these metal arrangements spread throughout the forest. Car parts, old appliances, electronic equipment, metal camping gear, all positioned with mathematical precision. The electromagnetic energy flowing between them was creating a network that stretched for miles. It was like someone had built a massive antenna array using scavenged junk. But an antenna array for what? The sun was getting low when I heard the clicking. Sharp, electronic pulses coming from the metal arrangements. click, click, pause, click, 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 pause. Like digital communication, but faster than any data transmission I'd ever heard. The clicking would start at one arrangement, travel through the network, and trigger responses from other nodes. Information was being passed through the system, but I had no idea what kind of information or who was sending it. I followed the clicking sounds deeper into the forest, and that's when I found the source. In a clearing about 100 yards off the main trail, someone had built the largest metal arrangement I'd seen yet. Car chassis, satellite dishes, cell tower components, and electronic equipment I didn't recognize were all connected with thick copper cables. The whole structure was maybe 40 feet across and hummed with so much electrical energy that the air around it shimmered like heat waves. But that wasn't the worst part. Standing around the perimeter of the structure were three figures. Tall, thin, and completely motionless. I ducked behind a tree and watched them for several minutes. They looked almost human from a distance, but something about their proportions was wrong. Too tall, arms too long, heads tilted at angles that would be uncomfortable for anyone with normal neck bones. Their skin looked wet and reflective, like they were covered in plastic wrap. One of them moved, and I saw sparks. Actual electrical sparks jumping between its fingers as it reached toward a piece of metal equipment. The sparks weren't random, they were controlled, precise, like the creature was interfacing directly with the electronic systems. That's when I realized what I was looking at. These things weren't just using the metal arrangements to collect electromagnetic signals. They were feeding on them. The entire network was a massive energy harvesting system, and these creatures were using it to sustain themselves. As I watched, one of the beings turned in my direction. It tilted its head, and I could see its face clearly for the first time. The features were almost human but slightly off, eyes spaced too far apart, mouth just a slit, skin that looked like wet latex. When it moved, small electrical discharges flickered across its surface. I'd been discovered. All three creatures began moving toward my hiding spot, and I could feel the electromagnetic field intensifying. The hair on my arms was standing up, and my skin felt like it was crawling with static electricity. They were using the network to triangulate my position, tracking the bioelectrical field generated by my nervous system. I ran. Behind me, I could hear the clicking sounds accelerating, the entire network activating in response to my movement. The creatures were coordinating through the electromagnetic grid, sharing information about my location and trajectory. Every time I changed direction, the clicking pattern shifted to compensate. The worst part was how my body responded to their presence. The closer they got, the more I could feel my nervous system reacting to their electromagnetic field. My muscles were twitching involuntarily, my heart rhythm was irregular, and my vision kept flickering like a TV with bad reception. They weren't just tracking my bioelectricity, they were trying to interfere with by it. I made it back to the main trail and kept running until my legs gave out. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, the clicking sounds had faded and my electronics were working normally again. Phone had full signal, GPS was tracking correctly, even my watch was keeping proper time. I hiked out that night by flashlight and drove straight home. Looking back now, I still don't know exactly what those things were or where they came from. But I think about them every day at work. When I'm up on a cell tower, surrounded by all that electromagnetic energy, I wonder if I'm feeding something I can't see. If there are creatures out there that have learned to live off the signals we're constantly broadcasting into the atmosphere. I've never been back to Devil's Backbone Ridge, and I never will. But sometimes, when I'm working on a particularly active tower, I'll notice my equipment behaving strangely. Readings that don't make sense, interference patterns that look almost like communication. And I have to wonder if those signal feeders have expanded their network beyond that remote forest in Tennessee. If they're closer to civilization now than they used to be. Back when I was 42, I was managing a little grocery store in Waynesboro, Virginia, trying to keep my head above water and my marriage from completely falling apart. I'd been with Danny for 15 years, and honestly, I can't tell you exactly when the hitting started. It was gradual, you know? A shove here, a slap there, always followed by apologies and flowers and promises it wouldn't happen again. But it did happen again. And again. The thing about living with someone who hurts you is that you start to disappear piece by piece. First, you stop seeing friends because explaining the bruises gets exhausting. Then you stop doing things you love because he doesn't like them. After a while, you can't remember who you used to be before him. I was just this hollow version of myself, going through the motions at work, coming home to walk on eggshells, sleeping with one eye open. What finally broke me wasn't even something he did to me. It was our dog, Rex. This old golden retriever, who'd been with us for 8 years, never hurt a soul. Danny came home drunk one Thursday night in October, mad about something at his job, and when Rex got excited and jumped up to greet him, Danny kicked him so hard Rex couldn't walk right for 2 weeks. That's when I knew I couldn't stay anymore. If he'd do that to Rex, what would he do to a kid if we ever had one? I filed for divorce the following Tuesday. Stayed in a motel for a few nights while Danny blew up my phone with texts that went from begging to threatening and back again. I turned my phone off, called in sick to work, and decided I needed to get as far away from everything as possible while I figured out what came next. I'd always loved hiking before I met Danny. Used to spend weekends on the trails when I was in college, back when I still did things just because I enjoyed them. The Appalachian Trail through Shenandoah seemed perfect. November meant the tourists would be gone, and I could have some real solitude to think. Maybe remember who Patty Wilson was before she became Danny's punching bag. I drove up to Skyline Drive on a Thursday morning, November 14th. I remember the date because it was exactly 1 week after I'd filed the papers. The parking area at the trailhead was almost empty, just my beat-up Honda and one other car. Perfect. I packed light, my old college hiking gear, a cheap tent from Walmart, enough food for 4 days. The plan was simple: hike a section of the trail, camp alone, and give myself time to breathe without anyone watching me. That first day felt like freedom. Real freedom, for the first time in years. Nobody knew exactly where I was. Nobody was checking their watch, wondering when I'd be home. Nobody was going to hurt me or Rex. I hiked slowly, taking my time, actually looking at the views instead of rushing through everything like I usually did. The bruises on my arms were fading from purple to yellow, and for once I wasn't trying to hide them under long sleeves. The woods were quieter than I remembered. I mean, it was November, so I expected fewer birds, but there was this strange absence of sound that made every footstep seem too loud. The air felt thick, almost humid, which was weird for a cool fall day. But I figured it was just the weather. Maybe a storm coming in. I made camp that first night feeling genuinely hopeful about my future. Cooked some instant mac and cheese on my little camp stove, watched the sunset filter through the bare trees, and went to sleep in my tent feeling like maybe I was going to be okay. For the first time in years, I felt safe. But around 2 a.m., I woke up with the worst stomach cramps I'd ever experienced. It wasn't regular hunger. This was deeper, more urgent, like my body was eating itself from the inside. My stomach was making these awful sounds, not growling, but this wet, churning noise that scared me. I felt weak and shaky, even though I'd eaten dinner just a few hours before. I dug through my pack and ate a granola bar. Then another. Then a whole bag of trail mix. Nothing helped. The hunger just got worse, this gnawing emptiness that food couldn't touch. By dawn, I'd eaten almost 3 days' worth of supplies, and I still felt like I was starving. I tried to rationalize it. Stress from the divorce. Sleeping outside for the first time in years. My body adjusting to being away from Danny's constant tension. But this felt different. This felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Friday morning, I packed up and kept hiking, thinking exercise might help. The strange quiet in the woods was even more noticeable now. No birds at all. No insects. Even the wind seemed muted, like the forest was holding its breath. The air had gotten thicker too, almost syrupy. Each breath felt like work. Around midday, I stopped to rest near this fallen log covered in bright green moss, and something bizarre happened. The moss looked appetizing. I know how that sounds, but I'm telling you, that moss looked like the most delicious thing I'd ever seen. Rich and vibrant, like fresh lettuce or something. I stared at it for probably 10 minutes, fighting this overwhelming urge to get down and eat it. Then I started noticing other things. Tree bark looked rich and textured, like chocolate cake. The dirt under my feet smelled like fresh bread. Fallen leaves looked crispy and flavorful. Everything natural around me seemed more appealing than any food I'd brought. I tried to eat a protein bar for lunch, and it made me violently sick. Threw up everything I'd eaten that morning. But when I walked past a patch of wild onions, my mouth started watering. I told myself to keep moving, but I ended up pulling up some bitter roots and chewing them. They tasted incredible. That afternoon, the hunger got worse. I tried eating my regular food, but everything from my pack tasted like cardboard or made me nauseous. Instead, I found myself craving things I'd never thought of as food. I ate a handful of dirt, rich, dark soil, that somehow tasted better than any meal I'd ever had. I chewed on tree bark that was surprisingly satisfying. Fallen leaves tasted like gourmet salad. I kept telling myself I was having some kind of breakdown. But that night, when I looked at my reflection in a creek, I saw changes that couldn't be explained by stress. My teeth looked sharper. My fingernails were longer and darker, more like claws. My skin had this grayish tint, like I was slowly turning into part of the forest. Saturday morning, I woke up and knew something was seriously wrong. My senses were different. I could smell things from impossible distances. The mineral content of soil, the age of fallen logs, the paths animals had taken days ago. And when I heard other hikers in the distance, my first reaction wasn't relief at potential help. They smelled like meat. That's when I understood what was happening. The mountain was changing me into something that hunted people. The hunger wasn't just affecting my diet, it was rewiring my brain, replacing human thoughts with predatory instincts. I was becoming the forest's hunting tool. The human part of me, the part that remembered being Patty Wilson from Waynesboro, was shrinking. In its place was something older, hungrier, designed to lure people deep into the woods where they'd never be found. And the terrifying part was that it felt natural. Right, like this was what I was always meant to become. Saturday evening, I encountered my first real test. A young woman, maybe 22, hiking alone with an oversized backpack and bright pink gear. She'd made camp near a stream about half a mile from where I was hiding. Because that's what I was doing now. Hiding, watching, planning. I spent hours studying her routine. She was careless, too trusting, left her food out, didn't properly secure her campsite. She was perfect prey. Vulnerable, isolated. No one would hear her scream. The thing that scared me most was how naturally these thoughts came. I wasn't thinking like Patty anymore. I was thinking like a predator that had been hunting in these woods for centuries. The mountain had awakened something ancient inside me, something that understood exactly how to make people disappear. Sunday morning, I began my approach, moved silently through the trees, staying downwind, using hunting techniques I'd never learned but somehow knew. The girl was breaking camp slowly, taking her time, unaware she was being stalked. I got within 50 feet of her before she noticed something was wrong. She kept looking over her shoulder, that primal instinct telling her she was being watched. But she couldn't see me. I'd become part of the forest now, invisible among the trees. I was planning my approach when she stopped to take a selfie. As she angled her phone, I saw her wallpaper, a family photo. Her, with her parents and a younger sister who couldn't have been more than 16. All of them smiling, arms around each other, the kind of pure family happiness I'd never experienced. The girl in the photo looked exactly like I might have looked at that age. Before Danny, before years of being told I was worthless. She had this bright, hopeful expression that reminded me of who I used to be, or who I could have been. Seeing that photo cracked something inside me. The human part of Patty that was almost gone suddenly roared back to life. I realized I was about to destroy someone's daughter, someone's sister. This girl had people who loved her, who were waiting for her to come home safe. Just like I'd been someone's daughter once, before everything went wrong. I forced myself to run away from her campsite. As soon as I was far enough away, I made myself vomit up everything I'd eaten from the forest. The pain was excruciating, like my whole body was fighting against returning to human form. But I kept going, forcing up dirt and bark and leaves until there was nothing left. The transformation back was agony. It felt like being turned inside out, every cell in my body screaming in protest. But slowly, over the next several hours, I started to feel like myself again. The predatory instincts faded, the unnatural hunger subsided. My reflection in the stream showed normal teeth, normal skin, normal fingernails. I hiked out that night in complete darkness, fighting residual cravings with every step. By the time I reached my car at dawn, I could eat normal food again without getting sick. But something had changed permanently. I could feel it, a mark the mountain had left on me, a connection that would never fully break. Even now, 3 years later, I sometimes catch myself craving the taste of rich, dark soil, especially when I'm stressed or alone. I moved to Richmond after my divorce was finalized, somewhere with plenty of people and very few trees. I still hike occasionally, but only on popular trails with lots of other hikers around. And I always warn other women who are thinking about solo camping in remote areas, especially women who are vulnerable, who are running from something. There are things in those mountains that are older and hungrier than anything you can imagine. They can sense when you're already broken, when your defenses are down, when you're ready to become something else entirely. The mountain marked me that weekend. I can feel it sometimes, like a whisper in the back of my mind, telling me how good that dirt tasted, how right it felt to hunt. The hunger never really goes away. It just waits. And sometimes, on really bad days, I wonder if I'll be strong enough to resist it forever. Back when I was 19, I'd just dropped out of community college after burning through 2 semesters and most of my savings on classes that felt like expensive daycare. My parents were giving me the silent treatment, and my boyfriend Jake kept making these little comments about how I was wasting my potential. The whole thing was suffocating me. Jake suggested we take a long weekend in the Monongahela National Forest, said we needed to get away from everyone's opinions and figure out what we actually wanted. November seemed perfect for it. Cold enough to keep the casual hikers away, but not so brutal we'd freeze our asses off. I should mention something about Jake. He was one of those guys who got obsessed with local history, always reading about old settlements and abandoned mines, talking about how much more real life was back then. When we found that homestead site 3 miles off the main trail, I knew we weren't leaving anytime soon. The ruins weren't much to look at, just stone foundations where a cabin used to be, maybe from the 1800s. But that root cellar built into the hillside had Jake practically vibrating with excitement. The wooden door had rotted away decades ago, leaving this rectangular black mouth cut into the earth. Even in broad daylight, our flashlights couldn't penetrate more than a few feet inside. "We're camping here tonight," Jake announced, already dropping his pack. It's like sleeping with history. Something about the place made my skin crawl. The air felt thicker near the cellar entrance, and there was this smell. Not quite decay, but something organic and wrong. Like meat that's been left out just long enough to start turning. But Jake was already setting up our tent, talking about how the original family probably stored vegetables down there through the winter, how we were the first people to see this place in probably 50 years. I helped him with the tent, but I made sure we pitched it a good distance from that opening. As the sun started to set, the temperature dropped fast. November in the mountains doesn't mess around. We built a fire and heated up some soup, and for a while it felt like the romantic getaway we'd planned. Jake wasn't lecturing me about school, and I wasn't snapping at him for treating me like a child. Around 11, we crawled into our sleeping bags. The fire had died down to embers, and the silence was absolute. No insects, no night birds, nothing. That should have been my first real warning. Even in November, the forest isn't completely dead. I woke up to scratching sounds, not the random scraping of an animal, but something rhythmic, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across stone in a steady pattern. The sound was coming from the direction of the cellar, and it would go for maybe 30 seconds, stop completely, then start again. Jake was still asleep, so I lay there listening. The scratching seemed to be spelling something out, short scratches, long ones, pauses. Like someone tapping out Morse code, except I could tell it wasn't random. There was meaning in those patterns. I shook Jake awake. "Do you hear that?" He sat up, instantly alert. The scratching started again, clearly coming from inside the cellar. "Probably just some animal," he whispered, but he was already reaching for his flashlight. "I'll check it out." Everything in me wanted to tell him not to go, but I'd been called paranoid and dramatic enough for one weekend. He unzipped the tent and walked over to the entrance. I watched his flashlight beam probe the darkness as he leaned forward. "Jesus Christ," he said softly. "Ashley, you need to see this." I crawled out of the tent, and the smell hit me immediately. Stronger now, like something had been rotting down there for months. Jake's light revealed stone walls that went down about 8 feet, but at the back there was an opening that shouldn't have existed. A tunnel mouth that his beam couldn't find the end of. The walls were covered in scratches. Deep gouges in the stone that looked like they'd been made by human fingernails, carved so deep in some places that chunks of rock had been torn away. The patterns were everywhere, on every surface, overlapping each other like layers of desperate messages. "That tunnel has to go back at least 50 feet, Jake said. "And look at these marks." Some of the scratches formed recognizable letters, HELP carved shakily near the entrance. Below that, TRAPPED. Further down, what looked like PLEASE. "Let's go back to the tent," I said. My voice sounded strange, like the air was too thick to carry sound properly. "This is incredible," Jake said. "Someone was trapped down there, maybe during a cave-in or something. We could be looking at a piece of real history here." But when morning came, there were new messages. Fresh scratches in the soft stone around the entrance that definitely hadn't been there the night before. And they weren't random marks, they were words. Full sentences carved in shaky, desperate letters. "Don't go back to sleep, we can hear you up there. So many of us down here been calling for help so long." "Someone's fucking with us," Jake said, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Has to be. Maybe some other campers." I backed away from the entrance, but Jake was already climbing down into the cellar with his flashlight. The smell got worse as soon as he dropped below ground level. Not just decay now, but something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. "Jake, don't. Holy shit." His voice echoed strangely, like he was in a cathedral instead of a small underground space. "Ashley, this isn't just a cellar. There's a whole network down here, tunnels going in every direction." I could see his light moving around below, illuminating passages that seemed to branch off like the roots of some massive tree. The beam would disappear down one tunnel, then reappear from another opening, like the whole hillside was honeycombed with passages. "The walls are covered in writing," Jake called up. "Names and dates going back decades. Sarah M. 1987. Can't find the entrance anymore. Mike Chen 2003. Something watching me in the dark. Jesus, Ashley, there must be 50 different names down here. Jake, get out of there. Right now." But his voice was getting fainter, like he was moving deeper into the tunnel system. Then I heard something that stopped my heart completely. Jake's voice calling my name from somewhere else entirely. "Ashley?" The second voice was definitely Jake's, but it was coming from off to my left, from a different part of the hillside. "Ashley, where are you? I can't see the entrance anymore." But Jake was right below me. I could still see his flashlight beam moving around in the cellar. "I'm right here," the Jake below me called back, but something was wrong with his voice. It sounded flat, like someone reading words they didn't understand, like an actor who'd learned the lines, but not the emotion. The real Jake, the one calling from the tunnels, started screaming. Not surprise or pain, but pure terror. The kind of scream that comes from seeing something your mind can't process. It echoed through the underground passages, bouncing off stone walls until it sounded like a whole crowd of people screaming. Then his flashlight went out. "Jake?" I called down into the darkness. "I'm here, Ashley." The voice that answered wasn't quite right. The pronunciation was perfect, but it was missing something essential. Like hearing your own voice played back on a recording, recognizable but fundamentally wrong. More voices started calling from the tunnels, a woman sobbing and begging for help, a man shouting directions that made no sense, a child asking for their mother. All of them echoing through the passages. All of them sounding just slightly off, like recordings that had been played too many times and lost their clarity. I ran. I didn't try to help Jake, didn't grab our gear, just ran toward where I thought the trail was. But every path I took led back to the homestead. I'd follow what looked like a clear trail for what felt like an hour, pushing through underbrush and scrambling over fallen logs, only to come out of the trees and see our tent and that black mouth in the hillside again. The voices followed me, Jake calling my name in that wrong, flat tone. The woman's still crying. New voices joining in, people I'd never heard before, all asking for help, all sounding like they were coming from different parts of the tunnel system. Like there was a whole community down there in the dark, lost and wandering through passages that went on forever. But they weren't people anymore. I understood that with the part of my brain that still remembered how to be afraid. Whatever was down there had been collecting voices for a long time, playing them back like a broken radio, trying to tune into stations that no longer existed. The worst part was that some of the voices were starting to sound more like Jake, like whatever was down there was learning from the real thing, getting better at the impression. By the fourth or fifth time I heard it call my name, I almost answered. I finally stopped trying to follow trails and just started walking straight through the forest. I fought through briars that tore my clothes and skin, climbed over deadfalls that scraped my hands raw, pushed through patches of undergrowth so thick I couldn't see 5 feet ahead. I walked for hours, ignoring the voices that kept calling from behind me, until I stumbled out onto a Forest Service road just as the sun was setting. A ranger found me there 20 minutes later, hypothermic and babbling about underground voices. They organized a search party that night, but it took them 3 days to find Jake's body in a sinkhole system about 2 miles from where we'd camped. The official report said he'd fallen through unstable ground and gotten lost in the natural cave system below. The medical examiner found evidence of multiple impact injuries consistent with falling down a shaft, plus signs of hypothermia and dehydration. According to the Forest Service, the people had been getting lost in that area for decades. The limestone bedrock was full of sinkholes and underground passages that were easy to fall into and impossible to navigate without proper equipment. I never told them about the voices or the carved messages. I never mentioned that Jake had climbed down into that cellar voluntarily, or that I'd heard him calling from the tunnels long after his flashlight went out. Who would believe it? But I did some research afterward. Spent weeks in the library going through old newspaper archives and historical records. Turns out that homestead site had a reputation going back over a century. The last family to live there, the Hartmans, had reported strange incidents in 1923. People going missing in the woods nearby, voices calling from underground. The family left suddenly in November of that year, abandoning everything they couldn't carry. Before the Hartmans, there were the McKinneys in the 1,882nd. Same stories, same pattern. People would come to explore the old root cellar, and some of them wouldn't come back out. The Forest Service has no official record of the site. When I tried to file a report about the dangerous cave system, they told me there was no homestead in that area and no record of any sinkholes matching my description. But I found old survey maps from the 1,952nd that show a structure in exactly the spot where Jake and I camped. I never went hiking again. Never even liked being alone in quiet spaces after dark. Jake's death got ruled an accidental death, and maybe officially it was. But I know what I heard down there in those free tunnels. And I know he's still there somewhere in the dark, along with Sarah from 1,987 and Mike from 2003 and all the others who thought they were just exploring a piece of history. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night and the house is completely quiet, I still hear his voice calling my name. Not the real Jake. I learned to tell the difference. This one has that flat, wrong quality, like something that learned to speak by listening to recordings. It's getting better at the impression, though. More convincing every time I hear it. Last month, I got a call on my cell phone. Unknown number, no caller ID. When I answered, Jake's voice asked me why I left him down there in the dark. Asked me why I didn't try to help. It sounded exactly like him, except for that barely perceptible wrongness that made my skin crawl. I changed my number after that, but I know it won't matter. Whatever's down there in those tunnels has been collecting voices for over a century. And now it has. Mine too. It heard me calling Jake's name that night, heard me crying and begging for help as I stumbled through the forest. And I know that someday, when some other couple finds that homestead site and hears scratching sounds coming from the cellar, they're going to hear my voice calling for help from the darkness below. Just another recording in whatever collection that thing has been building down there in the tunnels beneath the mountain. The only difference is, I'll know they can hear me. My name's Derek Martinez, and I work as a cell phone tower technician out of Richmond. I was 26 that November when my supervisor sent me up to West Virginia to inspect some equipment failures in the remote tower network. 3 towers had gone dark over the course of a week. No signals, no diagnostic data, nothing. Corporate was losing money on dead zones, and since I was the only tech willing to drive into the middle of nowhere, I got the assignment. The weird thing was, all 3 towers were in a rough triangle around the Dolly Sods wilderness. I'd never heard of the place before, but looking at the maps, it made sense why the towers were struggling. Deep mountain country, brutal weather, and according to the local dispatcher, a history of equipment just giving up for no technical reason. The company had been replacing hardware up there for 15 years. Always the same story. Everything would work fine, then suddenly stop transmitting. I figured it was probably just terrain messing with the signals, maybe some kind of natural electromagnetic interference from iron deposits or something. I'd seen plenty of dead zones in my 5 years doing this job, but the supervisor seemed nervous about it, kept asking if I was sure I wanted to handle it solo. When I pressed him about it, he just said the locals had been calling corporate with strange complaints about voices coming through their phones when the towers were still working. Probably just cross signals, but it made me curious enough to pack extra diagnostic equipment. The drive up took most of Friday. I checked into a motel in Parsons and planned to hit the first tower Saturday morning. The desk clerk, an older woman with that mountain accent, asked where I was headed. When I mentioned Dolly Sods, she got quiet for a long moment, then said, "November's a bad time to be up there alone." I asked what she meant, but she just shook her head and handed me my room key. Saturday morning was cold and overcast, typical November weather for the mountains. The first tower was about 8 miles up a Forest Service road that turned to gravel, then dirt, then barely a trail. When I finally reached it, I could see why we were having problems. The tower looked fine structurally, but something was wrong with the equipment housing. The metal was discolored, like it had been exposed to extreme heat, but there were no signs of fire damage. Stranger still, my handheld radio started picking up interference the moment I got out of my truck. Not normal static, voices. Faint, but definitely human voices speaking in overlapping conversations. I'd heard cross signals before, but this was different. The voices seemed old, like recordings from decades past, and they were all talking about the same thing: being lost in these mountains. I climbed the tower to check the transmitter array, and that's when my equipment started failing. First, my digital multimeter went dead, then my radio, then my phone. One by one, like something was systematically draining them. But here's the thing that really got my attention. My electromagnetic field detector started spiking before it died. Readings higher than anything I'd ever seen, like the entire area was saturated with energy. By the time I climbed back down, the voices on my dead radio had gotten clearer. I could make out individual words now. People calling for help, giving locations that didn't match any modern landmarks. Near the old Seneca settlement, by the lightning tree where Martha was buried, following the Cherokee Trail to the Salt Lick. References that sounded like they came from the 1800s, maybe earlier. That's when I started finding the personal items. Scattered around the base of the tower were things that didn't belong. An old leather boot, hand-stitched, probably a century old. A rusted lantern with glass still intact. A child's wooden toy carved in a style I'd never seen before. And newer things? 2. A digital watch from the 90s, a flip phone, a GPS unit with a cracked screen, all of them arranged in a perfect circle around the tower base, like some kind of offering. I gathered everything into a pile and photographed it with my backup camera, the only electronic device still working. That's when I noticed something carved into the tower's base that I'd missed before. Names, dozens of them, scratched into the metal with knife points or rocks. Some were faded and old, others looked recent. At the bottom of the list, in fresh scratches, I saw Derek Martinez, followed by today's date. I ran to my truck and tried to start it. Dead. The engine wouldn't even turn over, like the battery had been completely drained. I popped the hood and checked the connections. Everything looked normal, but my voltmeter wasn't working to test the charge. I was stranded 8 miles from the main road with no way to call for help. That's when the voices started coming from everywhere at once. Not just from my dead equipment now, but from the trees themselves, the rocks, the air around me. Hundreds of voices, maybe thousands, all calling out in desperation. Men, women, children, speaking in dialects that spanned centuries, native languages I couldn't identify, colonial English, modern accents from all over the country. All of them lost, all of them afraid, all of them trapped in this place. And then I heard my own voice among them. "Hello? This is Derek Martinez, tower technician. I'm stranded near grid reference." My exact voice, speaking words I hadn't said yet, describing a situation I was living through in real time. The mountain wasn't just collecting voices, it was predicting them, recording conversations that hadn't happened yet. I grabbed my pack and started hiking toward the road, but the voices followed me, getting louder with every step. They weren't random anymore. They were responding to me, calling my name, telling me to stay. My grandmother's voice, dead for 8 years. "Derek, honey, don't go so far from home." My college roommate who died in a car accident. "Man, you've got to see this place. It's incredible." The mountain was learning my history, pulling voices from my memory and using them against me. It knew about Marcus in Iraq, about my grandfather's farm, about conversations I'd had years ago. Every step I took seemed to feed it more information, make it stronger. By the time I reached the second tower, 3 miles down the trail, the sun was setting and the temperature was dropping fast. This tower was in worse shape than the first. The entire equipment housing had been torn open from the inside, like something had burst out of it. The metal was twisted and warped, but not from any external force. It looked like it had been stretched from within. The circle of artifacts around this tower was bigger, more elaborate. Hundreds of personal items arranged in concentric rings. Wedding rings, eyeglasses, dentures, hearing aids, pacemakers, yuan ti. Things that should have stayed with their owners. In the center of the arrangement was a pile of old bones, human bones, with newer items scattered on top. Cell phones, car keys, driver's licenses with photos of people I didn't recognize. That's when I understood what this place really was. It wasn't just collecting voices, it was collecting people. The towers weren't failing because of electromagnetic interference. They were being used as some kind of amplification system, broadcasting the trapped souls of everyone who'd disappeared in these mountains over the past 2 centuries. The company had unknowingly built a network to strengthen whatever ancient thing lived here, giving it the power to reach farther, call more people to join its collection. My backup camera started working again, but when I checked the display, the photos I'd taken earlier were different. The same scenes, but now I was in them, standing with the artifacts, arranging them in the circle, carving my own name into the tower base with a smile on my face, like I was happy to be there. The voices were coming from inside my own head now, not just from the air around me. Dozens of conversations playing simultaneously in my skull, all the people who'd been lured here over the years, still talking, still calling for help, still trying to warn others away. But their warnings had become bait, their fear turned into a lure for the next victim. I felt my phone vibrate in my dead pocket and pulled it out. Somehow it was working again, showing full signal strength in an area that shouldn't have any coverage at all. Text messages were flooding in, all from my own number, all sent to emergency contacts I'd never programmed. Lost in Dolly Sods. Equipment failed. Need help. Grid reference 39.1234, negative 79.4567. Getting dark. Can't find trail. Something wrong here. Please send search and rescue. I can hear others calling for help. The mountain was using my phone to call for more victims. Every message was designed to bring rescue teams, hikers, anyone who might care enough to come looking. And when they arrived, they'd hear the voices too, see the impossible signal strength, follow the calls deeper into the wilderness where the towers could add them to the collection. I smashed the phone against a rock, but it kept working, kept sending messages. The screen showed my battery at 100% no matter how long I used it, powered by something that had nothing to do with lithium and circuits. That's when I heard the helicopters. Search and rescue, responding to the automated distress calls my hijacked phone had been sending. I tried to wave them away, screaming that it was a trap, but my voice came out wrong. Instead of warnings, I heard myself calling for help, begging them to land, telling them exactly where to find me. The mountain was using my body now, my voice, my movements. I was becoming another lure. Another tool to bring fresh victims to feed whatever ancient hunger had been growing stronger here for centuries. But as the helicopter circled overhead, I felt something else, anger from the thing controlling me. The pilots weren't landing. They were maintaining altitude, speaking in radio chatter I could somehow hear despite having no equipment. Professional search and rescue, not amateur hikers. They knew the area, knew the stories, knew better than to trust distress calls from dead zones. Negative on visual confirmation. Area shows no thermal signatures. Recommend ground team approach from Eastern Access Road. They were leaving. The thing had overplayed its hand, made the situation too obviously wrong for experienced rescuers to ignore their training. I felt its grip on me loosen as it realized the trap had failed. That's when I ran. Not down the trail this time, but straight through the woods, crashing through underbrush and over rocks, following what I hoped was a northwest bearing toward the main road. The voices chased me, screaming in rage now instead of false comfort. My body felt wrong, like it wasn't entirely mine anymore, but I kept moving. I broke through the tree line at full dark and found myself on Route 32, 3 miles from where I'd left my truck. A passing driver, a local who asked no questions about why I was bleeding and running through the mountains at night, gave me a ride to my motel. I called my supervisor from the motel phone and told him I was done. Equipment failure, hostile terrain, whatever excuse would get me out of there. I drove back to Richmond that night and submitted my resignation Monday morning. Found a new job doing electrical work in the city, nothing involving radio towers or remote locations. But the real change was what I started researching. Missing persons reports from that area going back 150 years. Dozens of them, all with the same pattern, missing people vanishing near the 3 tower locations, equipment failures in the area, unexplained radio transmissions picked up by nearby communities. The Seneca had stories about the place, called it where voices steal voices. Early settlers reported hearing their dead relatives calling from the mountains, luring them to disappear forever. The cell phone company had built their network right on top of something that had been feeding on human communication for centuries. Every tower made it stronger, gave it more range, more power to call to potential victims. And every person who disappeared became part of its voice, part of its ability to mimic and lure. I still work with electronics every day, but I won't go near radio equipment. Can't handle being around cell towers, even the ones I used to service. Because sometimes, late at night, when the signals are just right, I can still hear them, all those trapped voices, calling out warnings that sound like invitations, desperately trying to save others while being used as bait. The worst part is knowing that somewhere in that electronic chorus, my voice is calling too. The thing kept a piece of me, a recording of my fear and desperation that it can use to lure the next technician, the next hiker, the next person foolish enough to investigate strange equipment failures in the mountains. 3 months after I quit, I heard that 2 new techs went missing near Dolly Sods. Their bodies were never found, but their phones kept transmitting distress calls for weeks afterward, calling for help that would only bring more victims to feed the thing that turns human voices into hunting songs, broadcast on frequencies that reach straight into your soul.